everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Muriel, and in this video I'm going to do a hopefully short but sweet little review of the Talon duology written by Jen Williams. So book 1 is, as you can see, Talon's sister, book 2 being Titan Child. So as some of you may know if you've been with me for a while, The Winnowing Flame, also written by Jen Williams, is one of my favorite works of fantasy of all time. I absolutely adored that trilogy, and so when I heard about this duology, I was like, well, I might as well give it a go since I enjoyed The Winnowing Flame so much. I didn't really know that much about it going into it, but I knew that it would have griffins, and griffins are probably my second favorite mythological creature after dragons, and I feel like they're underrepresented in fantasy and they need more love, so I was like, yay! Fantasy with griffins. And that's about it, really. Also, I found this physical copy at Worldcon Glasgow last year, so I just bought it. And that was that. So, yes, I love The Winnowing Flame, yay griffins, and obviously I'm going to compare some of this to The Winnowing Flame. Now, what is this about? I'll read you the back cover real quick. When Soldier 11 was transformed into a herald, a magical killing machine in the Imperium's brutal conquest, her mind was wiped clean. But strange visions still show her glimpses of the ancient and mysterious island of Brittleton. Now with the war won and the Imperium satisfied, she wants to find out who she really is. Envoy Kato has done a number of important little jobs for the Imperium, most of them nasty, all of them in the shadows. His newest assignment is to escort the bone-crafter Gynid Tylee as she travels across the Imperium. But Tylee's ambition alarms even Kato, and her conviction that she has found a new source of Titan bones buried deep in the earth could lead to another, even bloodier war. Innis was raised by the Griffins, yeah, they're called Griffins here, not Griffins, but okay, and has never seen another human face. She lives wild on Brittleton with her Talon sister, Taruk. By choosing not to kill Innis when she was just a baby, the Griffins may have doomed themselves, because the girl's past is coming for her and it carries a lethal blade. This back cover actually gives you a lot of information about the plot already. So basically, you have a secondary fantasy world that is very, very similar to our own, or rather, the bits of it containing mainland Europe and the British Isles. And Ireland, that's less relevant to this story. And by very, very similar, I mean that literally, you get a map. I do love me some fantasy maps, so point for that. But you do get these maps in the book, and if you've ever seen a map of, you know, Great Britain, that is Great Britain, and then that is Europe. And, I mean, it was very, very obvious to me. I was like, okay, interesting, let's see what you do with it. So basically, you have mainland Europe, and in mainland Europe, you have the Imperium. Maybe it's supposed to be reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire. I'm not sure about that, but okay, you have an Imperium, and you have the Isle of Brittleton. It's Britain, right? The Imperium has been conquering all of the countries of mainland Europe, basically, and they rely on Titan bones for this. Because in the distant past, you had all these fantastical creatures called Titans. Griffins, who still exist in the contemporary time of the story, are Titans, but you also had giant bears. There's actually still a giant bear. I love the giant bear, but I'll come back to that. Giant boars, unicorns, who are apparently assholes, krakens, phoenixes maybe, and then a humanoid kind of titan, but I won't say more because I do want to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. But most of the titans have died out, however they left their bones behind, and scientists in the Imperium have found a way to use these bones to do magic and alchemy, basically, and to create super soldiers. The Imperium wants to keep expanding because, you know, that's what empires do. However, they've never been able to conquer Brittleton, just like the Romans were never able— well, no, that's not true. In this world, so that was a big mistake on my part, but in this world, no, they're not been able to conquer Brittleton, and Brittleton is divided into several different queendoms, so you basically only have queens, not kings, and Brittleton has its own cast of priests and magic users called the Druin, instead of Druins, and they are led by one of the few remaining titans, one of the last remaining titans, a giant bear. That was very cool. And they live in harmony with the forest and the wild places and the wildwood, and then they're also spirits in the wildwood. And then to the very north of Brittleton, basically where Scotland would be in our world, you have the Griffins, and Griffins are very wild. They are supreme predators, and they basically do not tolerate any humans in their territory. So that's the setting. Now you have three main characters in the story. It is a multi-point of view story. You have Levin, who basically was a soldier in the Imperial Army, except when they make their super soldiers, they wipe their memories clean, but they're giving these augments made from Titan bones. They're basically infused with Titan bones, and it gives them these angel wings, these kind of ethereal blue light angel wings, and these blue light swords they can summon at will, but then they're discharged from campaigning, and so she wants to learn more about her past, and she goes to Brittleton to do so. Then you have Kaito, who is basically an Imperial spy master and assassin, and he is tasked to accompany the royal alchemist and Titan ore crafter Jinid Tylee to go to the southeast, what you kind of think is supposed to be Turkey in our world, to find potentially a new source of Titan bones, because it's a finite resource and the Imperium is running out of them, but they need more of it to keep the military campaigns going, etc., and basically their power. And then you have Innis. Innis was orphaned as a baby, and then she was basically found by a couple of griffins, and instead of just butchering her and feeding her to their own chicks, one of the griffins was like, I think there's something special about her, and they bring her back to their nest, and they raise her as one of their own. So she grows up with a griffin sister she's very attached to, but ultimately she's a human being, but she wants to be a griffin, and, to keep it short, eventually she is exiled with her sister and goes to the Griffin Seers and the Griffin Witches and explores her nascent spiritual powers and spirit walking powers and things like that. And this is not really a spoiler, all of these plot threads will eventually connect, and then there are also a couple of other important points of view in the story. There is a Druid character named Killian, who is tasked to accompany Levin whilst she is in Brittleton, because everyone is kind of keeping an eye on her, because again, there are no friendly diplomatic relations between the Imperium and Brittleton. And then there is a Brittleton princess, who is the daughter of Queen Brudica, who is basically the queen of Alt London. She's also tasked to accompany Levin, and so she becomes a point of view character in the second book. Killian is a point of view character in the second book as well. I don't think he is in the first. In the first, it's Levin, Kaito, and Innis, but then you have these additional points of view in book 2. So prose-wise, I don't have much to say. It was good, what it needed to be to bring the world of the Imperium and Brittleton to life. It was about as good as the prose in The Winning Flame, as far as I'm concerned, so yeah, it was good, it did the job. The pacing was very good in book 1, however, I must note that there is a time jump between book 1 and book 2. I think it's 2 years? 2 to 3 years? And then everything is rather fast-paced and very high stakes in book 2, and I felt like it needed more breathing room. Ironically, it might be a case where duology needed to be stretched out, which isn't something I experience often. But yeah, I felt like a lot in terms of world-building potential was kind of wasted in book 2, because it's very much go, 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 go. And so, yeah, it lacked breathing room, and it was, I guess, a bit too fast-paced for my liking. In terms of character, it was overall decent to good. I wasn't super attached to any one character, unlike the situation with the Windwing Flame. I cared about characters in the Windwing Flame a lot more, and I cared about the non-human characters in the Windwing Flame a lot more than I did here. I did like the Griffins, and I didn't dislike any one character, but I wasn't particularly attached either. Now, there is a heterosexual romance that starts in book 1 that I really did not enjoy. Overall, there are actually 3 romances. None of them were actually that good to my mind. But yeah, the main heterosexual romance did not pass my sniff test. It wasn't quite insta-love, but I just didn't buy into it at all. And yeah, it left me cold. Unlike the romances in The Windwing Flame, I thought the romances in The Windwing Flame were way more convincing and moving than those in the Talon duology. Now, just as with The Windwing Flame, there's a heterosexual romance, a lesbian one, and a gay male one. But they just felt a lot more rushed in this duology, and I was just kind of like, whatever. Now, just as with The Windwing Flame, there is diversity representation in the Talon duology, if that's important to you. The thing is, I'd say it was a bit less subtly realized or organically realized that it wasn't the Winnowing Flame. I don't know. In the Winnowing Flame, it just felt, okay, it's a part of the world. Cool. Here, it felt a bit more woke-ish, but it's hard to explain exactly why that is. It just felt a bit more on the nose, a bit more unsubtle. Maybe because the world of this story is so similar to our own in the past, and so I think that's where the dissonance came in. But it wasn't egregious either, so, make of it what you will. The world building of the Talon duology was really neat, at least at first. So, yes, there is this huge similarity between the secondary fantasy world of these books and our real world. And at first, I thought it was cool. It gave me the feeling of Jen Williams basically taking all of these bits of folklore, of history from Western Europe and our real world, and just kind of throwing them in the blender and shaking them up with bits of fancy world building and then spreading them out on the page, which is a similar feeling to the one I got from The Winnowing Flame, where the fantasy itself felt like a beautiful blend of freshness, newness, and very familiar elements for, well, fantasy literature. So I did have that feeling at first, and even though it did all feel a bit cheeky in some ways, and a bit on the nose, with Brittleton instead of Britain, or Queen Boudica instead of Queen Boudica, the Druid instead of the Druid, I was having a good time, and I felt pretty excited about this approach to world building, and I just wanted to know more and discover this world and discover how it would parallel or not our real world and its history. Unfortunately, that kind of went away as the plot progressed and as I got into book 2, because the world building ultimately kind of felt by the wayside. I felt like a lot of potential was ultimately wasted, and I was left wanting so much more out of this world. In no small part because the story eventually focuses all in on Brittleton itself, and I wanted to know more about the lands of the Imperium, or even the land to the southeast that reminded me of Turkey, although there's kind of a tropical forest there, so also not really. But it was all about Brittleton, ultimately. Not really a spoiler. It really focused on that land and its people and its magic, etc. And so the scope became too narrow for my taste and my curiosity, and I was a bit disappointed with that. I mean, it's fine. It's a choice on the part of the author, and, fair enough. It's valid, but I guess that's not why I was excited at first getting into this duology. And then other aspects of the world building were just missing, again, for my personal preferences, or didn't really make a lot of sense to me. I wanted to know more about the religions of this world, or its deep history. There was an issue with linguistic world building. Not that I expected a fully fleshed out conlang. Not every author wants to do that or has the time to do that. Not every story requires that. But you do have characters going from land to land, country to country, and they just automatically are able to talk to other people, to foreigners. No translators are ever mentioned in the text, are ever mentioned to be needed for people to talk to one another, understand one another. And I was like, how is that possible? So everyone just shares a language universally, which again, it's fine. It's acceptable, but it also makes the world building a bit less good in my opinion and breaks my immersion a little bit. But okay, there was also, and maybe that's why I mentioned the wokishness a little bit, where I was like, it's just not subtle, and then it affects the quality of the world building. So homosexuality is accepted amongst humans. Okay, fine. It's also a thing amongst griffins. Okay, fine. There's homosexual behavior in lots of non-human animals. But then griffins marry. And so the griffins who raise Innis, the human orphan, she's raised by 2 male griffins. Okay? And they call each other husband. And that broke it for me a little bit. I'm like, it's one thing for griffins to, mate in same-sex pairs. Fine. But they're husband and husband, and I guess heterosexual pairs would be husband and wife. No marriage ceremony is ever mentioned for griffins. Why would griffins use a term for something that is deeply human? Marriage. Especially since they're not really shown to be human-like in so many other ways. That was very bizarre, and it just felt off. That kind of broke my immersion a little bit. There are also still things about the world building that I enjoyed throughout the duology. I love the fantastical creatures. I love the titans. There were griffins. outside of those little bits that felt off, I love the griffins. The humanoid titans that pop up at one point were cool too. There was some neat quasi-horror writing linked to them, especially in book 1, that I appreciated, but I won't say more. There's a giant freaking bear that leads the druid, and he was really cool and I loved him, so point for that. The world building and writing around the wildwood of Brittleton, where the druids live and record history and things like that. Oh, I love that. That really spoke to me. There are forest spirits made of branches and twigs and bones that roam the wildwood. I love that. Anything that had to do with the spirits and their magic. There's even a reference to fairies, who are also wild spirits in like Alt Cornwall. And then even the griffins have spirits of the dead, and they have their own shamans or witches. And the way they understand the afterlife and dead souls was actually quite beautiful, even in places. This whole thing about soul ties, about seeing these red threads that connect souls who love one another, and how you need to gently sever those soul ties when someone dies to be able to let them go to the afterlife, and you're able to go on with your life and just remember them with love. And that was some really beautiful, moving writing linked to that little bit of, I guess, yeah, spiritual, quasi-religious world building. So I love that. And then the way the Titan ore is used to make super soldiers, that was a really neat idea. All of those bits of the world building were really cool and kept me going with the story and kept me interested enough in the plot and its stakes and the characters. Although, ultimately, I wasn't that emotionally gripped either, but I'll come back to this very shortly. In terms of theming, I honestly don't have much to say. This duology for me is a lot more entertainment-driven fantasy than ideas-driven fantasy, although it's not devoid of them completely either. But I don't know, The Winnowing Flame was so emotionally impactful and had something to say in terms of acceptance of the death of civilization and environmental change and trauma and dealing with it. Here, I just kind of followed the story and its characters, and I didn't get any strong theme out of the text. I guess you could say there's something about found family in the Talon duology, just like there is something about found family in The Winnowing Flame. You could maybe argue there's something about, well, also accepting a change of ages, society changing, and being more tolerant of diversity, kind of, and different peoples coming together for a common good, which is also in The Winnowing Flame, but I just found it a lot stronger and more convincing and gripping in The Winnowing Flame. Here is very much watered down and mild, which again is okay, but that also means that this duology will be way less memorable for me going forward. Because ultimately, as much as I am ideas driven, with ideas I need emotions too, and this didn't really move me all that much. The Winnowing Flame delivered a massive punch to my heart in a good way. This was fine. I just wasn't that emotionally invested in the story, the characters, or the stakes, or the themes, well, because they were so mild. Like, The Winnowing Flame left me in tears at the end. This was okay, though I will say the ending of the duology felt very satisfying. It made sense. It fit the plot and what had happened with the characters and their character arcs, etc. So that was nice. You know, I always enjoy having a good fitting ending. But that's about it. Yes, I was moved a little bit by that whole thing with soul ties, a little bit of world building, but that's really it. So would I recommend this? Well, I would not recommend it if you want a bit of fantasy to pass the time. I mean, you could definitely do worse than pick this up. If you like Jen Williams literature, then I guess, yes, definitely read this. I mean, if you want Griffin representation in your fantasy literature, okay, yes, definitely. There's a lot of Griffin content, so I do approve in that respect. And then ratings-wise, I guess, as a whole, you know, so the duology together, it would probably be a 7 out of 10, a soft but respectable 7 out of 10, so that's still bad by any means. And I would still definitely read more Jen Williams in the future, if she writes something that sounds interesting enough, obviously, but this, you know, even though this wasn't as good as The Winnowing Flame, that doesn't mean I wouldn't ever read anything else by Jen Williams. No, not at all. So on that final note, I hope you found this little review interesting, entertaining, informative, that it allowed you to pass the time in a somewhat pleasant fashion. And I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you all at some point in the next video. But until then, bye-bye.